Okay, so today we are once again talking about Ludwig snares, and specifically the question I want to pose is whether the Supralite is the modern day equivalent of what the Acrolite was back in the day. So I love the Ludwig Acrolite, and we've talked about it extensively on this channel. I've got two of them from the 70s. I think they have a great neutral characteristic that works in almost any situation. They're easy to recommend because there's tons of them floating around on the used market because they were just a ubiquitous student model drum that were relatively affordable when they came out and are still really affordable on the used market. So it's kind of a no-brainer when recommending a snare drum upgrade or if someone's trying to get a Ludwig snare sound. But the problem is that a brand new Acrolite, because they are still being sold, but a brand new Acrolite is around or north of $400, which is a little more expensive than you'd get one of the original ones for. And there are a number of hardware improvements on the modern Acrolites, but it's not quite the same price point recommendation for someone who is looking for something in that $200 area. Now, what I realized today as I was walking through West Coast Drum Shop here in Bellevue, Washington, the shop that is literally across the wall from me, is that the Supralite really occupies the same product segment that the Acrolite occupied back in the day. Back in the day, the Acrolite was, of course, whatever you want to call it, the entry level, the student model drum, the less expensive version. And at the time, they were saying it was because it had 8 lugs, but it was the more affordable option, which is exactly what the Supralite is now. Now, the Acrolite, of course, over time sort of became legendary in its own way, but the Supralite really hasn't had the time to grow in popularity. So I've been messing around with a couple of borrowed Supralites from West Coast Drum Shop next door, and they really do feel familial with the Acrolite. They feel very familiar to me, and it is, I think, still the Ludwig sound. I've talked in the past about how I think that even though there are differences between Superphonics and Black Beauties and Acrolites, that they're actually more similar than they are dissimilar. And with that in mind, I was thinking, if someone really wants to get a new drum and get into the Ludwig sound, the Supralite is really the way to go if you don't want to go with a vintage Acrolite. So the other benefit that you get with a new Supralite is that you can pick a variety of depths that you wouldn't be able to if you were looking for a vintage Acrolite. So vintage Acrolites almost always came in 5x14 dimensions, whereas a 6.5 would be super, super rare. And they make the Acrolites now new in 6.5 versions, but again, they're north of $400, whereas these are right around $200. So you can get them in, I believe, 5, 5.5, 6.5, and what's really cool is an 8-inch depth. That's this big mamma jamma I've got rocking here. And there aren't that many affordable snare drums that come in an 8-inch depth. So if you've never tried an 8-inch deep snare drum, they're worth checking out. They are obviously physically deep, but they're also deep sonically. And it's just a cool other tone to have in your palette. So maybe you want something a little different, like a Ludwig 8-inch deep sound, but you're not going to get an 8-inch deep Black Beauty. The Supralite would be a great way to have that tool. So what I want to do here is stop talking for a second and just compare the Supralites I have here. I've got a 5.5 and the 8-inch, and I'm going to compare those to my 5x14 Black Galaxy Acrolite. And I know that right off the bat, this is not a fair comparison because the depths are different, and these are brand new, like right out of the box. And then my Acrolite is from the 70s, so it's well loved. It's got different heads on it, so they are tuned similarly, but of course, this is not a completely perfect comparison. I just want to give you some frame of reference of what you might get with a vintage Acrolite and then what kind of sound you would get with a Supralite. So let's check them out. So just my impressions playing them in the room and as someone who's played a lot of Ludwig snares, that the Supralites are absolutely in keeping with the rest of the Ludwig sound. I feel like, I've mentioned this before, like all Ludwig snares definitely have a certain vibe to them, and of course there are differences between them, but I think they're really more similar than they are dissimilar. And the Supralite is right in line with that. So the actual differences between an old Acrolite and a Supralite, one, the big one, is that the Acrolites are an aluminum shell and the Supralites are steel shelled. So common rhetoric would say that the aluminum shell is going to be a little drier and more neutral, and that the steel shell is going to have a little more life and a little more character to it. That is up for you to decide. The Supralite also has tube lugs, which I think looks really classy. I always like tube lugs on drums. And then ironically, the Supralites have 10 lugs rather than the 8 on an Acrolite, which was the big differentiator back in the day. Whether a drum was 8 lug or 10 lug is whether it was a premium model or not. So yeah, the modern entry-level Supralite has 10 lugs. And other than that, they are very similar drums. They've got very similar shell profiles. The hardware is very close, and I don't think there's anything wrong with picking up a Supralite these days if you want something brand new in lieu of getting an old Acrolite. Or if you want an 8-inch deep drum, again, and you don't want to spend an arm and a leg, Supralite is a great way to go. So I'd love to know your thoughts. Do you feel like the Supralite is comparable in the ways that I'm suggesting to the Acrolite? If so, or if not, let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.